So as you think about the second creation story and then what follows in the Garden of Eden, in your mind, what associations or ideas or words are attached to this story for you? Well, if
I'm gonna see where it stops.
it stops with their expulsion from the garden.
Oh, okay. So you're going through the end. Okay.
Well, I'm including that in this question, but we'll be just dealing with chapter 3 really next week. I could go ahead to a list that I made myself. I think of snake, and I wrote these in the order they occurred to me. Rib, fall, sin, curse, woman, man, naked but not ashamed. Naked but not ashamed. That was a concept that popped out to me as a little kid because, you know, it's pretty hard ingrained in us that you should be ashamed of your nakedness. Helper or helpmate, as Eve is described to Adam before she arrives. The phrase, not good to be alone, stands out. Who told you you were naked? Asks Yahweh walking in the garden. This woman you gave me. But the dominant feeling I get from the story that stuck with me through the years is one of shame, or why I should feel ashamed, or why humanity, broadly speaking, should be ashamed and to face whatever consequences result from that shame. That's my word association. I was wondering if that triggered anything in any of you.
Yeah. There's a quote here. What is this that you have done?
Mm.
How many times did I hear that in my childhood? What have you done?
Mm-hmm. Abel he picked up and threw a can of sparkling water 2 days ago, and my question to him was, why did you do that?
Could he tell you?
He just looked at me and felt very upset that he was in trouble.
It was fun, Dad.
Well, I think so many times, you know, it's very evident in young children that we don't think before we do things. And when somebody says, why did you do that? We have to stop and think, did I really have a reason? Or did I just react?
Yes. So you see a 2-year-old teetering on the edge of knowledge of good and evil, looks at what he does not know to be the forbidden can, and then throws it because, and I think Larry hit it spot on, because it's fun, and then sits in the shame, the confusing shame, as he draws the ire and frustration of his parents. That probably is a very confusing occurrence for a 2-year-old. Although for parents, those moments become very necessary as we try to teach them not to do things like throw full cans of water on the carpet just because. Was there anything else from these 2 chapters that sticks out to you?
Well, that man was made first in this story.
Yes.
Before, plants and the garden and
yes,
animals and so forth. And that's really the opposite order from the first story.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what's the significance of man being made first in this story as opposed to last in the other story?
We will get to that as we understand the objective of the storyteller, the meaning behind the story. They have different things that they're trying to say. But yet, go ahead.
in conjunction with that, there was such a difference in the way man was treated versus woman, just in that man was, Lord God gave man life and name. He gave man every seed, fruit to eat, the entire Garden of Eden, a companion. But he didn't give Eve her name. Adam did. He cursed her specifically. And I don't know, it just seemed that there was a very different kind of treatment. I noticed the fact that he let Adam name her instead of giving her her name, which I don't know if that's significant or not. But
Yeah.
um,
That is a detail that I missed. That certainly seems significant. That Adam, it names really everything that comes after him. Well, there are several differences that we've already been talking about, and these are from the website that I have down here, the Dr. Middleton, and I've decided as I was reading from his site that if I were going to type it out myself, I'd basically be regurgitating what he wrote. So I just copied and pasted it for us to read together these differences between the creation accounts 1 and 2. First, we've already talked about different names for God. And this is something that will continue throughout the Hebrew Bible, and it helps signal us to what literary tradition they come from in the context of their writing, although it's not always clear. In the first, it consistently uses Elohim, which is based just Hebrew for God. It's a generic word, like our English word God, right up to Genesis 2, verse 3. And then the second account uses the name Yahweh Elohim, which, just as an aside historical note, the word Jehovah is the same word. It was, that word Jehovah came out of German biblical scholarship. It is and it isn't the same word, actually. They did not know what vowels were to come between the consonants in the Hebrew equivalent of YHWH, because you remember the Hebrew alphabet didn't have vowels. And so scribal traditions remembered what vowel sounds to ascribe to these words. But so the German scholars guessed at this word in Jehovah, Jah meaning Yah, and Jah in German, they had a J sound for what we would make a yes sound for. And they got it wrong. And it was in the discovering of what's called the Masoretic text, which has little dots and dashes to signal as to what vowel should be used, that we learn that this word is actually Yahweh. That's just an historical side that I find interesting, that the word Jehovah actually is not in the Bible anywhere. But anyway, it is and it isn't. But anyway, starting in Genesis 2, verse 4, this is the word that's used, and that continues through the end of chapter 3, which is the formal end of the garden narrative about human creation. This compound name allows the garden narrative to serve as a link between the opening creation account, which introduces the creator God, and then this post-garden narrative, which predominantly uses Yahweh after the fact. And so this was to help the reader approach the other stories that follow, understanding that Yahweh is the creator God. Differences in style, scope, and organization. The two creation accounts also have different literary styles, scope, and organizational principles. Genesis 1 describes the creation of the entire cosmos, heaven and earth, over 6 days, with repetition and patterning, climaxing with God's rest on the seventh day. And by contrast, Genesis 2, the first chapter of the garden story, is more straightforwardly a narrative in the formal sense, with a series of tensions and resolutions. So you can see the first creation story as a series of concentric circles that narrow in focus as we come down to man made in God's image. And this one is more like a linear story, which doesn't really follow in those linguistic patterns of the first day, the second day, the third day. It more is trying to solve a problem, and we'll talk more about what the problem that is trying to be solved is later. And Genesis 2 really is about humanity. Everything else is more or less the backstage, the props to tell the story of Adam as he comes to an understanding of himself. And this was also just noted, different evaluations of the stages of creation. The two accounts have differing evaluations of the various stages of creation. Thus, Genesis 1 is peppered with statements at multiple stages of the creative process that God saw it and it was good at the end of, each pinnacle of creation. And ultimately, it was all very good, you'll remember. This story begins with Yahweh saying it's not good for man to be alone. So after man is created, we have a not good, and it's trying to solve the answer to this not good that would drive the plot that goes forward, trying to find an answer to this tension, which is the creation of woman. That's the answer that we find at the end of Genesis chapter 2. And we are clearly in a different literary world than Genesis chapter 1. As was also noted, there is a different order to the creative events. Genesis 1 starts with the earth inundated in water and this sort of chaos. And then God separates the waters into dry land. Then, as we discussed last week, things go from chaos to increasing complexity, but order as well. And Genesis 2 begins with the earth as a dry wilderness. It's already sort of there as the clay from which God will craft man first. And there's this steam or mist that comes from the land. So there's water there. And then attending to just those creative events mentioned in both chapters, these are the following differences. Genesis 1 has water first, then land, followed by plants, then animals, then finally humans. And that's male and female together. By contrast, Genesis 2 begins with the existence of land, then water, followed by human, then plants, then animals, and then woman is the last aspect of creation. Another question to ask when considering the differences, how many humans did God really create? We should, and I'm quoting Dr. Middleton here, we should also take special note of how many humans God created. While we often think of the first humans as a primordial couple, we need to balance the picture in Genesis 2 with that of Genesis 1, where God creates not individuals, but population groups in various niches, including flying creatures in the sky, swimming things in the water, and then on the land, both animals and humans, the latter designated by the collective noun Adam. Christians only read this account of human creation as an original couple because we retroject the Genesis 2 account back into chapter 1. But if you're paying attention to Genesis chapter 1, it just says male and female, he created them. And if it fits the pattern of the other animals, we're thinking this is probably a group of people, perhaps. We're to think of it as a community ready-made. So part of this exercise is untangling the two narratives from one another so that we can have them speak for themselves. Another difference is there is no other story like this story in antiquity. Remember last week we compared this story to the creation account of the Assyrians, Babylonians. And we talked about Marduk and the similarities between the Enuma Elish and the Genesis 1 story. We don't have a parallel story to this in the ancient Near East, although there are similar motifs like paradise, tree of life can be found elsewhere. And there's also other Old Testament passages that suggest that this was once more perhaps a more comprehensive story. And I included here in the PowerPoint some of those passages that touch briefly on the garden or on the trees. Genesis 13:10, Isaiah 51:3, Ezekiel 28:13 through 19, and then 31:8 through 9. And these seem to be quotations that indicate that there's maybe had been more literature out there or stories out there that were a part of this family of storytelling. Also, scholars date this story several hundred years earlier than the Genesis 1 creation account. It was likely composed between 900 and 800 BCE. During this period, the Hebrew people were transitioning, and this is something that is often lost as we back read into scriptures, our monotheism. The Hebrew people were transitioning into a monotheistic, universal understanding of their God. In much of the Yahwist texts, Yahweh is but a tribal deity of the Hebrew people, sometimes pitted against other, and to them, very real tribal deities. So when you read stories about the Israels and the Philistines and they're worshiping their God, say it's Baal, and it seems like Baal actually does sometimes help the Philistines and is efficacious. And we back read into the story this idea that to the Israelites, even back then, Baal was some form of hollow idol like we would see it now, but not so. And Yahweh at the time was seen to be the supreme deity for the Hebrew people. And as time would go forward, they would begin to see Yahweh as the universal deity. And then eventually it would settle into the form of monotheism that Judaism would land at, and then by extension Christians and Muslims. So you can go back to the first commandment with that understanding in Exodus chapter 20. And this is Yahweh's. There's two actual list of the 10 commandments, one in Deuteronomy and one in Exodus actually, and one is from the priestly camp, and then one is from the Yahweh's camp. And the one that's most common because of where it fits in the Exodus narrative is the Yahweh's one. And if you read it carefully, I am the Lord, translate Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods, plural, before me. And that's to cue us into the assumptions of the day, which there were other gods that you could theoretically have before Yahweh. And we'll be talking more on this next week as we consider Genesis chapter 3. My first slide is, who is this Yahweh person anyway? And it's a kind of a history of the development of Yahweh. So let's move on to the text. It reads, in the day, Yom, that the Lord God, there's the Yahweh Elohim, made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground, but a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. I found the best picture I could find to, I don't know if it really is in the mind of the ancient storyteller, this is supposed to be what it looks like, but this is the best I could find on Google. Sort of dry ground, formless, nondescript with some water there. 2 points I'd like to make, or 1 point really. I already called your attention to the difference already in how God is talked about. But this first Hebrew word, yom, in the day. One day, singular, as opposed to the 6 days with the 7-day rest. It all happens in the story on one day. And this is a conundrum to people who want to synthesize these two stories seamlessly. I think these stories can work well together and teach us profound things together. I don't need to reconcile them, but some people feel the need to do. And if you open some Bible translations, you will see this opening line translated, when the Lord God made the heaven and the earth and the heavens, which is just to ignore this word yom, which means in the day. It's not ambiguous. One day, that's what it means. But people who have trouble with the tension that seems to bring about between these two stories will say, well, it must mean day metaphorically or something like that. And even in the NIV, if you look it up, that's the way it's translated, when the Lord God, with maybe a footnote that you can look at to explain that it also can be read in the day. So you see sometimes the theological bias that we can bring to these stories, and we all do it too. We bring a bias and project, and confirmation bias is a very powerful thing. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, Adamah, which means humus or dirt, and from that word we get the word Adam, and breathed. And I point out this is the same word used in Ezekiel chapter 37 in the dry bones chapter, which is also a Yahwehist text. God with lungs, right? That's the question you're supposed to have. It's a very anthropomorphized view where God shares a lot in common with us, even the ability to breathe. Although I suppose when God breathes life, it's something that we can't pull off. And this will come out again in the next chapter as God walks in the garden and asks questions and things like that. And he breathes into the nostrils the breath of life. It was believed that breath, this is the same reason that the word for spirit is also the word for breath or for air. It's believed that in this breath is the life. And when you are inhaling and exhaling, this is the breath of life going in you and out of you, and it's a gift from God. And then it says that man became a living being, which if you do a breakdown of how that Hebrew word is translated living being, to give an idea, it's a word called nephesh, which has been translated in the Bible soul, self, life, creature, person, appetite, mind, living desire, emotion, passion. That which breathes, the breathing substance or being, soul, the inner being of man. Point C is significant. Living being can also mean life in the blood. There are passages later in the Bible where prohibitions are made about drinking blood because it was believed that in part our essence left us when we bled, that our who we were, our spirit was in the blood. Seat of the appetites. All this to say, this is a person who can now yearn and hope and pine and create similar to the God that formed this living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden, in the east. And there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground, the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life, also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You may recall last week, I had trouble finding a picture of the first creation account without the tree in the garden because they mash them all together. But if you remember, usually, I think every circumstance, there was just one tree. And that's often the way it's pictured, as if these two trees are one and the same. But it's clear there are two separate trees that we're talking about here. In the New Interpreter's Bible commentary, it is written, the awkward syntax of these texts, which occur at the beginning and end of the story, suggests that stories with different trees have been combined. Some think that only one tree is intended, the tree of life, namely the tree of knowledge, might be one way that they render it. But most interpreters discern two trees in the middle of the garden. The first tree mentioned symbolizes the fullest possible life, the eating of which would grant continuing life. Such a plant or tree occurs also in the Gilgamesh epic and elsewhere. The reference in 322 indicates that one would need to eat from that tree only once, as was also the case with the tree of knowledge. A river flows out of Eden, moving on, verse 10. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Fishon, which I put question marks there because we're not sure exactly what river that signifies, although there are some guesses, which we'll get to in a second. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah, which many believe to be the Arabian Peninsula, where there is gold, the text goes on to say. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon, probably, almost certainly, the Blue Nile, because it continues to say it is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush, which was Ethiopia, the biblical word for Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Syria, and the fourth is the Euphrates. I have this picture here to show you the kind of image that we're supposed to conjure in our minds when we read this, where you've got one river flowing from the right of your screen through the garden. That's the river of God, where the life that's symbolized in the water comes from, and then it branches out. 4 is often an impressive number, 4 corners of the earth. It was believed there were 4 seas, 4 directions on the compass. And so there's a harmony in this view of creation. But the problem is this is in reality, a geographic impossibility. Either way you cut it, what's described here exists in no place. Or as it's politely put in the New Interpreter's Bible commentary, the Garden of Eden does not equate with the world. This is another quote, if these 4 rivers all flow from the north of Eden, their identification should give us some clue as to the whereabouts of the garden. The problem is, however, that there is no central location from which all of these 4 rivers flow. The Euphrates and the Tigris are in the northeast region, whereas the 2 Nile rivers are in the southwest. And this is operating under the assumption that Pishon and Gihon are both branches of the Nile. But as this map on your right would indicate, Pishon is assigned to, in some instances, the Ganges, in others, because we're not quite certain. I like this next part because it gives some meaning to this idea that there are 4 rivers that are flowing in this geographically improbable, impossible way. Rick Lowry writes, the geographically impossible coordinates of the garden suggest that Eden is not a specific place. The 4 rivers that flow out of Eden do not at all occupy the same continent in the real world, much less share a common source. They do, however, define the boundaries of the inhabited world as ancient Israel knew it. Stand in at the source of the whole human world, Eden is everywhere, and therefore nowhere in particular. The story of Adam and Eve is the story of every man and woman, a meditation on the human condition. And that made me think of Thomas More's Utopia, which means literally no place. And in describing no place very well, you understand ourselves still better. As one more aside, you notice on the map here, you've got the whole region. And I did see one person draw like a big circle kind of around all of these rivers to kind of lump them into one geographical location and placed the trees somewhere in that circle. But if you actually took out a ruler or a guide to gauge the distance, we would be talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of square miles. And I felt that was another example of an attempt to synthesize, harmonize what really doesn't need to be messed with to get the most important points. Verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to keep and till it. Similar theme to Genesis 1, a steward, a caregiver of this place. And the Lord God commanded the man, you may eat of every tree in the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. Just that tree is named. Not the tree of life is there's no prohibition there, which I find is interesting. But then it goes on to say, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. So a few questions for you. Why is having knowledge of good and evil a bad thing? I might ask, do you think having knowledge of good and evil is a bad thing? That's another way. That's really what's behind the question.
Comes up to that how you use it. I'm fascinated. You shall die, and just a query. Are we talking about moving from immortality, which is sort of implied in my view by the stories, to becoming immortal again?
Well,
they did eat of the tree of life, or a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So
they did. They did not eat of the tree of life. And again,
No.
We'll talk about this at length. It's good to bring it into the story because we're talking about the trees, but we'll talk about this at length next week.
Yeah.
But the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the one that's forbidden. And as soon as that happens, the reason they are barred from the garden is to prevent them from becoming immortal. So
Yeah.
in the story, it's bad enough, I guess, that the humans have reached a certain kind of godlikeness in the knowledge of good and evil. This is not a knowledge that the animals possess, and they don't bear any of the consequences of it. They just eat the food that is in abundance, and they just sort of live and exist. And if we leave the ecosystem alone, we would see more and more of that today. But humans with this knowledge and these responsibilities find ourselves never quite knowing how to live best in the world. And this story is more about that than about the question of immortality. Go ahead.
So if you have knowledge of good and evil, you're no longer innocent. I mean, you can become cunning. You can become you can use knowledge against other people, other beings, instead of just being in the moment and being
Yes.
free from certain ways that we use our wits against one another. I don't know. There's something about knowledge that helps us, but also we can be very cruel with using knowledge. It's like being able to use the mind of the other. That's what sociopaths are really good at. So I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's a double-edged sword. What gives you the cunning to exploit also gives you the wherewithal to make a brave and courageous and selfless act when you feel like that is the good that goes up against the evil. So I guess the next question is, in fast forward these thousands of years into our modern times, would you give up this knowledge, or is ignorance bliss?
We'll never know.
It's too late. History shows us that we screwed it up and also can accomplish great things with it.
Yeah.
So I'm planting a seed for next week, but one thing to consider, we read this story filtered through Augustine and Calvin in this conception of the fall, which is not a word used in the Hebrew Bible. It's not a description of what happens here in the story itself. So there have been some interpreters who have seen this as an ascendance of a kind, but with great consequences and responsibility. And so the question, is this a fall up? Or is it the day that everything went broken in humanity? Which way are we supposed to understand this? I think there's room for both interpretations, and I've got one that I like better, but I wouldn't say that it is the most accurate way to read it. Although I would say that there's certainly room for it in the story. But then the next question, just to point out one of the things that Yahweh says that doesn't happen: when they eat it, do they die? And I mean, it's not even supposed to be a gotcha question. They don't die.
Oh.
They don't die.
Isn't it the loss of the innocence?
Well, that's another thing. I mean, you could say that a loss is a form of death, but that is an inference that we want to put back onto the story to get that fall narrative that we're so captivated by, because that's, probably 1,200, 1,500 years of Christian theology foisted back onto this to find the moment where it all went wrong. But as we continue on to read, especially when we get to the snake part, right? The snake in much of the medieval drawings is the devil. But the snake in the story is there in the garden, placed there by God. And you have to wonder, if it's a perfect place to begin with, where did the snake come from? And if the snake is meant to be more broken or more flawed than the two humans that this cunning snake deceives, then why is God putting that thing in the garden in the first place? And this idea that it is the Satan that that develops as a person through the later Hebrew writings and on the Christian scriptures, the idea that this snake is to be thought of as that is a back reading. Make no mistake about it. It's something that we foist back onto the story from our own vantage point, but is not in the story when taken by its in face value. But again, a lot of teasers here. We'll be talking about that at length next week. I'm wanting to get ahead of myself, and I'm fighting the urge, or succumbing to the urge would be more likely. Verse 18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone." This is the first not good. In the last story, not that this writer is competing with the last story, but in the last story, remember, everything is good just because it is from the onset. So man is made, and a not good is named. And it's that he's alone. That's the first indicator that something isn't quite right and something needs to be done about it. So God says, "I will make him a helper as his partner." And the King James, this is the classic helpmeet. And it's reduced to this sort of quaint little, the woman as sidekick or accessory to the man who does the laundry in, the 1950s and even up to this day, or plays second fiddle. But in the Hebrew Bible, every other time that word helper is used to describe a relationship, it is used to describe God's relationship to us. So in any psalm where you read, "The Lord is my help and my strength," same word. I make that point to show that this word helper is not meant to place the woman underneath the man. In fact, it elevates and gives that kind of help that God would later give again and again and again to the people of Israel. The one who bailed out the woe-begotten and the fallen and the one in a bind. Because they have the strength and the capacity to do what the other could not do on their own. So you don't need to read a hierarchy into this word helper, although the word helper in English does have certain connotations today. But in the Hebrew, in every other instance it's used is to describe God's relationship as our helper, which I find, I like that. So verse 19. So, and this is in answer to this problem of man's loneliness. So keep that in mind. Here is the answer, the first answer. So, man is lonely. Out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them. It's the same way that it's described when all of the animals are brought to Noah later in the Yahweh's account, right? So they're paraded. So imagine this is God's made them and they're being paraded in front of Adam is the picture. To the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that became its name. The man gives names to all the cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man, there was not found a helper as his partner. So Yahweh Elohim's first answer is all of these animals. And it's not the answer. I wrote down facetiously, a swing and a miss, which sounds very sacrilegious. But there are other examples where God either regrets doing something or seems to name a swing and a miss. So I put Genesis 6:6, where that's where in the Yahweh's flood account, God says, "I regret ever making humanity. I'm going to wipe them out." That word regret. And it means what it says. Wished I hadn't done it. Very different than the God that we get filtered through Greek philosophy in all of its perfection, which would become the common understanding of God through the Christian lens for some time. But in this story, this God can regret something. In 1 Samuel 15:7, God says to the prophet Samuel, "I regret that I ever made Saul the king. Wished I hadn't done it." First, very sure, anoint that man. Now, wished I hadn't done it. So this is another story in that vein. So in response to that, God caused a deep sleep to fall upon man. And this is the next answer. And he slept. And then he took one of the ribs, closed up its place with flesh, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And I picked a picture here where they're both naked, because remember, if it makes you blush, this is when they're not supposed to be ashamed. So I guess we can just deal with it. But so this is where we get the beginnings of the back reading of patriarchy, and it also is reinforced by what follows. What follows is, again, another preview, an attempt to understand the cultural and societal reality and organization of that current day, where men were toiling in the fields and women were subjugated to men. And this is a story that is meant to try to explain how that came to be. But the question from the first half of the story is this the way things need to be? And is this the way things were meant to be? So is the point of woman coming out of man that woman is derivative of man? Or is the point the one that seems to be the line that Adam takes, flesh of my flesh? Is that the point? Is it the point towards a greater harmony and unity and answer to the loneliness? One who you can be with naked, which you could project other words like vulnerable, unabashed, and maybe unabashed and fully clothed, but not ashamed. Is that the point, or is the point the what regrettably becomes, people get fixated on even in the next chapter, woman being derivative and therefore less than? It doesn't need to go there. The story never needed to go there, but that is where it does go. But here we find one of the central themes of the story, and one of the points of the creation story, at least the second chapter. In the first creation story, all is proclaimed good from its inception. But in this story, we have something that is not good from the onset, which is loneliness. Yahweh makes it a priority to solve this problem. The other creatures are made to solve the problem, but they aren't enough. What's needed is an intimacy with someone whose flesh we share. In this case, the pinnacle of creation is the establishment of human community and intimacy. Once this is established, all is made good. But can it stay this way? What goes right and what goes wrong? So while the Genesis 1 account is cosmic in scope and chaos is called the order, the Genesis 2 account is far messier. The Genesis 2 earth is made in one day and in staggered stages. Man is made before the garden and then is placed there. The animals are made for man as an answer to his loneliness and need for help in the world. Woman is made to answer the problem, the only fit answer. Woman comes from man and is not made of the dirt like Adam and the animals. Eve comes from Adam's flesh. Eve is derived by God from Adam. This detail has gathered negative connotations. Are we meant to infer that man is better than woman? This is not a necessary inference and misses the point. One flesh is the point. Togetherness is the point. The antidote to loneliness is the point. Deep intimacy is the point. Flesh of my flesh does not mean that man is of higher value than woman. To the contrary, this places them in a codependent relationship. I think that patriarchal societies will always backread onto stories like this. And in fact, what follows is the beginnings of an explanation as to why this might be. And more on that next week. So I'm going to bring this back. And let's just have an open discussion and question and answer. Okay. So what do you all think? What sticks out? What caught your attention, or what questions might you have?
I guess you always wonder why the tree of knowledge of good and evil was put there in the first place, just to see if man would or would not follow God's command?
That's one, I would say, if not a dominant, the dominant theory. It's the test, which raises some questions about God.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other questions, other answers to that question that have also been, at times in points in history, more or less the main answer. And I'm trying to withhold going into that next week, but maybe it's a story about this is what I believe it is. It's a story about man's humanities. I will change it to humanities. In this story, it's man, right? There's no getting around that. But you should broaden it to humanity's grappling with what to do with wisdom, with the knowledge of a right way and a wrong way, and how we never quite handle that question well. We became more like God. The text says we became more like God. We're going to become really like God if we start to live forever. And remember, this is God as described like Yahweh, the God who can walk in the garden, or the God that you can argue with. It's a very anthropomorphic God we have here. And the humans in this story can become like that. It's what the people in the story of the Tower of Babel, similar deal, were striving towards. And that's unacceptable to the creator gods. They're not going to have that. We've got to know our place in this world, in this worldview. But the question as to whether or not humans are better off for having the knowledge of good or evil is actually a live question. And for centuries, in the Mishratic tradition that I've been talking about in previous weeks, that was the conversation. Is this a fall up, or is this a fall down? Or if it's a fall up, was it worth it? Is it worth it to bear the responsibility? Part of the responsibilities that God already had in knowing the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. And and there are some parts of the scripture where the answer is very clear. Yes, we call it the wisdom literature, where the possession of this wisdom is extolled as the highest virtue. And then there are others who seem to say the opposite, where man's wisdom is not God's wisdom. You've heard it said. I forget exactly what biblical passage that's from, where God says, "Your ways are not my ways." In other words, or the answer to Job is basically, you just can't know. You can't deal with the knowledge that I possess, the why behind it. So there's two answers that both come out in the scriptures. And this story is meant to wrestle with that tension. So I think it's unfortunate that, filtered through Augustine and others, that we come away with this story where it's all bad news. You don't have to read it that way. And so maybe the question, why did God put it there, isn't the right question. Maybe the real question that we're meant to grapple with is it a good tree to eat from? Whether it's there or no, if you have the option, is it something that we are better for?
So comparing the Creation 1 story versus Creation 2 in terms of, say, 6 days versus Yom, the 1 day, the point you were trying to make, I'm sorry, you kind of lost me. So I've never had problems with time, because I figure God's time is much different than my time. But you were trying to make a point there with the 1 day and people getting caught up in that. What am I to make of that again?
So the first point is, people want to synthesize these two stories, and you see it all the time. Make them out to be their one story. But they have different objectives. In the first one, the 6 days and into the seventh is meant to speak to the harmony of the creation story, called out of chaos. The point of the second one, and the reason why it can all happen in 1 day, is it's a linear narrative. It isn't like the first concentric circles with the the center being the creation of man and God's humanity in God's image. The point is this beginning place with Adam in his journey from loneliness to community. But then the next chapter, of course, makes it far more complicated.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So I kind of feel sorry for people who feel they have to sort of twist their minds and intellect in half to get these words to fit, because they miss so much.
Got it.
It actually makes the story, they're afraid that if you don't synthesize it, it will compromise the integrity of God. But in so doing, they cut themselves off from the wisdom and the teachings that have fed people for millennia. And it's a real shame. Mm-hmm. It's an approach that is actually, I think it has what's made the Bible inaccessible to so many. Because as we wear ourselves out trying to get all those pieces to fit in that way, a task that we never really needed to do in the first place, we say, well, there's just too much here, too many inconsistencies, too many bits of it that rub me the wrong way, and so I don't have the time or the energy. I mean, I don't know if you've ever sat through a Bible lecture where the teacher performed mental gymnastics and linguistic tricks to arrive at this sort of harmony. But it's exhausting. The amount of effort that must be put in, it takes a special kind of mind that can do it. And it's not necessary.
Yeah, the stories that are part of the Hindu tradition are, they're so long. The Mahabharata and all the different stories about their gods are so elaborate, and I'm sure they're inconsistent with each other. But one of my friends who was in residency and fellowship, well, many were from India, and so they were either Muslim or Hindu, but this particular one was Hindu, and she went to a Catholic school. And I said, well, how was that for you? And she said, no different. I said, what do you mean? She said, they have all the same kinds of stories. So, well, I hadn't thought of that before. So, she'd go into a Catholic sanctuary and there'd be all these statuaries and it'd be just like a Hindu temple. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. So then I realized that our stories are not so much different in a way, but
if not,
many
we have a tendency to make our stories different. We can all experience the same thing, but when it comes to our telling of how it happened, each one of us could tell it a little bit differently based on our background, our perspective, our lots of different reasons why we could come away with a different story from the same event.
And there are archetypal stories, meaning stories that fit an overarching pattern that is very repetitive. People make a big deal, and they should, about the various flood stories that seem to be on every continent, and in the deep cultural memories of ancient peoples. Indigenous peoples here in the United States have their own flood narrative. It seems to be something that's ingrained in the human psyche, and they often have similar points to be made. And I think this is what you would expect if what is in our stories that we just read, if they are pointing towards a deep truth, which is that we are all from the same source. We approach it through a different cultural lens, and we're not all saying the same thing. But sometimes the things that we feel we need to say come from our deep intuition and our own cultural shaping. And one of the critiques of postmodernism is that initially it didn't seem to, it didn't say that there is something true at the bottom of this. It said that there's just nothing. It's just all, Derrida was a philosopher and linguist that pretty much said it's a nihilistic. There's just no, even words, well, especially words, but there's really nothing that is true at the bottom of everything. And now the new iteration of postmodernism is to say, No, there is something, but our capacity to apprehend it, to prehend it, to see it is limited to our place in time, our cultural perspective, but also our five senses. And physics, studies of physics have really led us a long way into this, where they're discovering that reality is so much more complex, and there's so much behind the veil that we can only reach at by theory that explains other things, or through mathematics that my brother could understand because he's a mathematician that I can't. So then what you thought, like back with Hume or some of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, that you could just, everything you needed to experience, you could experience and then come to know everything. And now it's like, well, there's something true. And I use, it's actually a Hindu analogy, but it's multifaceted like a diamond. And we each see a part of the diamond that is true, but is not the same as in other parts of it. And none of us see the whole. So we approach these things through our tradition and through the stories that have held us and have taught us deep wisdom. And that's why I'm a Christian. And to be a Christian is to be different than other religions. And some of them say different things that I might have a critique of or a judgment of. But also you have to have great humility.
Yes, I would jump in here and share my view of the creation stories, plural. And I accept them pretty much as being mythic, of people trying to define who they are and where they came from. And not to be denying anything, but I will just add that I had a theology professor who made the statement, which I thought was fascinating, was that every myth that we have is based on fact somewhere in its beginning. So I think it's grabbing what's important of the story and not getting too wrapped up in the details.
Which that was the whole point of the first lesson, which is that's a new phenomenon. Like even history as a practice, being a historian is a relatively new thing. And the job of a historian is very important. What happened? Let's find out what happened as best as we are able. But that wasn't the objective or the goal of these storytellers and the people who first wrote these down. So in trying to find that kind of reliability, historic reliability in them, we've again missed the point they never had.
I hope I didn't bring a stop to the conversation.
No.
That's helpful.
Well, next week is, the reason why I wanted to do this all in one lesson was that's the third, chapter 3 is actually more interesting to me. And I like what we just talked about, but chapter 3, I think brings up a lot more questions about, from inferences, like from conversations about gender roles that get brought out of this. You see, Eve has to, suffer through childbirth and all of these things. And God says this is what she has to have happen. And then Adam has to toil in the ground. And that's, it's only really in the context of the 1950s and 60s where the working man was seen as the kind of hero, where that curse in Genesis 3 seemed like less of a curse, because it's, instead of literally toiling the ground by the sweat of our brow, we're wearing suits and we're taken seriously. And that's the price we have to pay because of the fall of man. So sorry. It's like, it's, we project so much on these stories from our own place and time.
It's our karma, somebody might say.
Our karma to be privileged and to come home to the childbearing wife and God put it this way, hon. It's just a way. No, like, and they're curses.
Yeah.
They're curses.
Mhm.
And they are an attempt to understand gender roles and patriarchal structures as they then existed. How did they get this way? This doesn't seem very fun. How did it happen? So more on that next week. I don't want to give the whole thing away. So, well, I'm going to sign off now. When this comes up as a recording, I'm going to edit out all of those middle things. So if you were wondering how this would look for someone else, they're not going to see that the screen faced the ceiling while I went and chided the kids, who did finally pull it together, I might add. So